In Defense of Women by H.L. Mencken, Section 10, The New Age, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The New Age, 42. The Transvaluation of Values. The gradual emancipation of women that has been going on for the last century has still a long way to proceed before they are wholly delivered from their traditional burdens and so stand clear of the oppressions of men. But already, it must be plain, they have made enormous progress, perhaps more than they have made in the 10,000 years preceding. The rise of the industrial system, which has borne so harshly upon the race in general, has brought them certain unmistakable benefits. Their economic dependence, though still sufficient to make marriage highly attractive to them, is nevertheless so far broken down that large classes of women are now almost free agents and quite independent of the favor of men. Most of these women, responding to the ideas that are still powerful, are yet intrigued, of course, by marriage and prefer it to the autonomy that is coming in. But the fact remains that they now have a free choice in the matter and that dire necessity no longer controls them. After all, they needn't marry if they didn't want to. It is possible to get their bread by their own labor in the workshops of the world. Their grandmothers were in far more difficult position. Failing marriage, they not only suffered a cruel ignominy, but in many cases faced the menace of actual starvation. There was simply no respectable place in the economy of those times for the free woman. She either had to enter a nunnery or accept the disdainful patronage that was galling as charity. Nothing could be plainer than the effect that the increasing economic security of women is having upon their whole habit of life and mind. The diminishing marriage rate and the even more rapidly diminishing birth rate show which way the wind is blowing. It is common for male statisticians, with characteristic imbecility, to ascribe the fall in the marriage rate to a growing disinclination on the male side. This growing disinclination is actually on the female side. Even though no considerable body of women has yet reached a definite doctrine that marriage is less desirable than freedom, it must be plain that large numbers of them now approach the business with far greater fastidiousness than their grandmothers or even their mothers exhibited. They are harder to please, and hence pleased less often. The woman of a century ago could imagine nothing more favorable to her than marriage. Even marriage with a fifth-rate man was better than no marriage at all. This notion is gradually feeling the opposition of a contrary notion. Women in general may still prefer marriage to work, but there is an increasing minority which begins to realize that work may offer the greater contentment, particularly if it be mellowed by a certain amount of philandering. There already appears in the world, indeed, a class of women who, while still not genuinely averse to marriage, are yet free from any theory that it is necessary, or even invariably desirable. Among these women are a good many somewhat vociferous propagandists, almost male in their violent earnestness. They range from the man-eating suffragists to such preachers of free motherhood as Ellen Key, and such professional shockers of the bourgeoisie as the American prophetess of birth control, Margaret Sanger. But among them are many more who wake the world with no such noisy eloquence, but content themselves with carrying out their ideas in a quiet and respectful manner. The number of such women is much larger than generally imagined, and that number tends to increase steadily. There are women who, with their economic independence assured, either by inheritance or by their own efforts, chiefly in the arts and professions, do exactly as they please and make no pother about it. Naturally enough, their superiority to convention and the common frenzy makes them extremely attractive to the better sort of men, and so it is not uncommon for one of them to find herself voluntarily sought in marriage, without any preliminary scheming by herself. Surely an experience that very few ordinary women ever enjoy, save perhaps in dreams or delirium. The old order changeth, and giveth place to the new. Among the women's clubs and the women's colleges, I have no doubt there is still much debate of the old and silly question: are platonic relations possible between the sexes? In other words, is friendship possible without sex? Many a woman of the new order dismisses the problem with another question: why without sex? With the decay of the ancient concept of woman as property, there must come inevitably a reconsideration of the whole sex question, and out of that reconsideration there must come a revision of the medieval penalties which now punish the slightest frivolity in the female. The notion that honor in woman is exclusively a physical matter, that a single aberrance may convert a woman of the highest merits into a woman of none at all, that the sole valuable thing a woman can bring to marriage is virginity, this notion is so preposterous that no intelligent person, male or female, actually cherishes it. It survives as one of the hollow conventions of Christianity, nay, of the Levantine barbarism that preceded Christianity. As women throw off the other conventions which now bind them, they will throw off this one too, and so their virtue, grounded upon fastidiousness and self-respect instead of upon mere fear and conformity, will become a far more laudable thing than it ever can be under the present system. And for its absence, if they see fit to dispose of it, they will no more apologize than a man apologizes today. 43. The Lady of Joy. Even prostitution, in the long run, may become a more or less respectable profession, as it was in the great days of the Greeks. That quality will surely attach to it if it ever grows quite unnecessary. Whatever is unnecessary is always respectable. For example, religion, fashionable clothing, and a knowledge of Latin grammar. The prostitute is disesteemed today not because her trade involves anything intrinsically degrading or even disagreeable, but because she is currently assumed to have been driven into it by dire necessity, against her dignity and inclination. That this assumption is usually unsound is no objection to it. Nearly all the thinking of the world, particularly in the field of morals, is based upon unsound assumption. For example, that God observes the fall of the sparrow and is shocked by the fall of a Sunday school superintendent. The truth is that prostitution is one of the most attractive of the occupations practically open to the sort of woman who engage in it, and that the prostitute commonly likes her work and would not exchange places with the shop girl or a waitress for anything in the world. The notion to the contrary is propagated by unsuccessful prostitutes who fall into the hands of professional reformers, and who assent to the imbecile theories of the latter in order to cultivate their goodwill, just as convicts in prison, questioned by teetotalers, always ascribe their rascality to alcohol. No prostitute of anything resembling normal intelligence is under the slightest duress. She is perfectly free to abandon her trade and go into a shop or factory or into domestic service whenever the impulse strikes her. All the prevailing gabble about white slave jails and kidnappers comes from pious rogues who make a living by feeding such nonsense to the credulous. So long as the average prostitute is able to make a good living, she is quite content with her lot, and disposed to contrast it egotistically with the slavery of her virtuous sisters. If she complains of it, then you may be sure that her success is below her expectations. A starving lawyer always sees injustice in the courts. A bad physician is a bitter critic of Ehrlich and Pasteur. And when a suburban clergyman is forced out of his cure by a vestry room revolution, he almost invariably concludes that the sinfulness of man is incurable, and sometimes he even begins to doubt some of the typographical errors in Holy Writ. The high value set upon virginity by men, whose esteem of it is based upon a mixture of vanity and voluptuousness, causes many women to guard it in their own persons with a jealousy far beyond their private inclinations and interests. It is their theory that the loss of it would materially impair their chances of marriage. This theory is not supported by the facts. The truth is that the woman who sacrifices her chastity, everything else being equal, stands a much better chance of making a creditable marriage than the woman who remains chaste. This is especially true of women of the lower economic classes. At once they come into contact, hitherto socially difficult and sometimes almost impossible, with men of higher classes, and begin to take on, with the curious facility of their sex, the refinements and taste and points of view of those classes. The mistress thus gathers charm, and what has begun as a sordid state of amiability not uncommonly ends with formal marriage. The number of such marriages is enormously greater than appears superficially, for both parties obviously make every effort to conceal the facts. Within the circle of my necessarily limited personal acquaintance, I know of scores of men, some of them of wealth and position, who have made such marriages and do not seem to regret it. It is an old observation indeed, that a woman who is previously disposed of her virtue makes a good wife. The common theory is that this is because she is grateful to her husband for rescuing her from the social outlawry. The truth is that she makes a good wife because she is a shrewd woman, and has specialized professionally in masculine weakness, and is thus extra competent at the traditional business of her sex. Such a woman often shows a truly magnificent sagacity. It is very difficult to deceive her logically, and it is impossible to disarm her emotionally. Her revolt against the pruderies and sentimentalities of the world was evidence, to begin with, of her intellectual enterprise and courage, and her success as a rebel is proof of her extraordinary pertinacity, resourcefulness, and acumen. Even the most lowly prostitute is better off in all worldly ways than the virtuous woman of her own station in life. She has less work to do, it is less monotonous and dispiriting, she meets a far greater variety of men, and they are of classes distinctly beyond her own. Nor is her occupation hazardous and her ultimate fate tragic. A dozen or more years ago, I observed a somewhat amusing proof of this last. At that time, certain sentimental busybodies of the American city in which I live undertook an elaborate inquiry into prostitution therein, and some of them came to me in advance as a practical journalist for advice as how to proceed. I found that all of them shared the common superstition that the professional life of the average prostitute is only 5 years long, and that she invariably ends in the gutter. They were enormously amazed when they unearthed the truth. The truth was to the effect that the average prostitute of that town ended her career not in the morgue, but at the altar of God, and that those who remained unmarried often continued in practice for 10, 15, and even 20 years, and then retired on competencies. It was established, indeed, that fully 80% married, and that they almost always got husbands who would have been far beyond their reach had they remained virtuous. For one who married a cabman or petty pugilist, there were a dozen who married respectable mechanics, policemen, small shopkeepers, and minor officials, and at least 2 or 3 who married well-to-do tradesmen and professional men. Among the thousands whose careers were studied, there was actually one who ended as the wife of the town's richest banker. That is, one who bagged the best catch in the whole community. This woman had begun as a domestic servant, and abandoned that harsh and dreary life to enter a brothel. Her experiences there polished and civilized her, and in her old age she was a grande dame of the greatest dignity. Much of the sympathy wasted upon women of the ancient profession is grounded upon an error as to their own attitude toward it. An educated woman, hearing that a frail sister in a public stew is expected to be amiable to all sorts of bounders, thinks of how she would shrink from such contacts, and so concludes that the actual prostitute suffers acutely. What she overlooks is that these men, however gross and repulsive they may appear to her, are measurably superior to men of the prostitute's own class, say her father and brothers, and that communion with them, far from being disgusting, is often rather romantic. I well remember observing, during my collaboration with the vice crusaders aforesaid, the delight of a lady of joy who had attracted the notice of a police lieutenant. She was intensely pleased by the idea of having a client of such haughty manners, such brilliant dress, and what seemed to her to be so dignified a profession. It is always forgotten that this weakness is not confined to prostitutes, but runs through the whole female sex. The woman who could not imagine an illicit affair with a wealthy soap manufacturer, or even with a lawyer, finds it quite easy to imagining herself succumbing to an ambassador or a duke. There are very few exceptions to this rule. In the most reserved of modern societies, the women who represent their highest flower are notoriously complacent to royalty. And royal women, to complete the circuit, not infrequently yield to actors and musicians, that is, to men radiating a glamour not encountered even in princes. End of In Defense of Women, Section 10, The New Age, Part 1.